Hello, lovelies. Apologies for my recent relative absence, shall we say. There's been just so much going on. I hoped to do more tackling the election and the various election battleground issues and the background and context of UK elections for people outside the UK, but I don't know that there's necessarily enough time to go into that to the extent I would like to. But we do have most of the manifestos, and we will have all the major manifestos by Monday. So it seems like that would be a good opportunity to look into what the various parties are promising and give you some of my sort of analysis and thoughts on that. I've got my Lenny cap and my red jacket to assuage the Corbynistas. So let's have a look at the Labour manifesto. It's an interesting one. In many ways it is a harking back to the 1970s. They want to kind of hit the reset button and take us back to how we were before Thatcherism in a lot of ways. And I can't say that I necessarily have any problem with that. The criticisms directed at the Labour manifesto are the ones that are always labelled towards Labour manifestos. Where's the money going to come from? I think that's a tad unfair, and I don't think anything that they're promising is impossible, beyond the bounds of possibility. Many of them are things that other European countries do perfectly fine and seem to see a decent return on their social investment. So really, like a lot of things, the only thing that really seems to stand in the way of us doing what they suggest is the will to do so. And austerity hasn't really worked for anybody, and spending, massive social investment, infrastructure and so on is a historically proven way to get out of financial difficulties in countries. You spend money to make money, right? You invest in efficiency and things that boost productivity and recirculate money in the economy, and that gives an overall boost to everyone. It can seem counterintuitive, but it's true. At least historically speaking, so far as we can see. But let's get into what they're saying. Given Corbyn's background, it's not really too much of a surprise that he would seek to get involved with and piggyback off things like Extinction Rebellion, and to try and engage the youth vote and the student vote and the middle class vote by getting involved in environmental issues. But Labour traditionally has been a party of industry and manufacturing, which have been big polluters. It's been involved in the trade unions, whose primary concern is workers' rights, not the environment. So it seems like a bit of a difficult shift, and one that may not perhaps be entirely 100% honest, or may not be able to deliver on what it's offering due to the involvement of the trade unions, who will be unwilling to make sacrifices in their own way, in exactly the same way that bosses, CEOs, the big capitalist movers and shakers have been unwilling to alter their behaviour, but because it'll cost them. So they may well run into issues just bottom up rather than top down issues. They're hoping to create 1 million new jobs through investment in green industry, a Green New Deal, though I kind of resent us repeatedly in the UK using the phrasing that you have in the US. Now, there was a time when we were pretty innovative when it came to alternative energy. We kind of led the world in tidal energy, for example, but because alternative energy became under the purview of the nuclear body, there was a tendency to ignore it and to underinvest and so on, and so we lagged behind and other nations leapt ahead. Can we make up the ground? Hard to know. We still have a technological lead somewhat when it comes to bioengineering, genetics, that sort of thing, but that's more to do with biofuels and so on, which are less green and less useful than renewable sources. Now, our country is an island. It is buffeted by weather quite often. We have a lot of tides, a lot of coastline, a lot of wind. In theory, we could harness a massive amount of this, and we could become an energy exporter in the way that Iceland is because of its geothermal resources, but for us it's wind and tide and so on. But there are lots of things in the way of that, not least of all NIMBYism, not in my backyard, in which people are in principle in favour of wind farms, green energy and so on, but in practice don't want it built near them. So just locally there's plans to put a new incinerator/power plant in, which would be very modern technology, very low emissions, lots of carbon capture technology and so on, and would produce energy from waste that would otherwise go into landfill and cause massive long-term pollution in terms of CO2 and methane and so on. But because it's local, people don't want it. And there's been similar issues with attempts to set up wind farms near here. So even for people who care about the environment, they want someone else to make the sacrifice rather than them locally. So that's a big issue. And land is at a premium here in the UK. We have a high population, relatively low amount of land, and the empty spaces we kind of want to keep green for other environmental reasons. So it's kind of hard to see how they're going to go about this. I mean, they seem to take climate seriously, but they place the issue lower down the scale than economic issues. Like I said, it's to do with bottom up rather than top down, but there's still blockades for Labour actually doing anything, mostly because of the involvement of trade unions. They do commit to new nuclear power, which is a good thing. It's really the only practical stopgap solution we have until we transfer to renewable or someone cracks the issue of fusion. So it's good to see them committing to that and that understanding that it's a necessity. They do want to drive energy efficiency schemes. Now, they're not the first people to promise that, and in practice they haven't been particularly practical. There have been offers for subsidised and in some cases free additional house insulation, assistance upgrading your boilers and so on. In practice it's unwieldy, doesn't get taken up as much as perhaps it should, still ends up costing people money, so the people that need it the most still can't afford to get it done. There's a scheme to replace boilers. We have an oil-fired boiler here, which I wish we didn't, because that's not particularly environmentally friendly, though it is efficient, so it's environmentally friendly in that way. I would like to exchange our boiler for a new up-to-date, AAA rated version of an oil boiler, and there's supposed to be a scheme to help you pay to replace that. I registered for the scheme perhaps 2 years ago. Various boiler replacement companies have called up, said they're going to follow up or send someone round or whatever and help us through the process, and then never show up. So it's all tied up in red tape. It needs to be a grant rather than a loan or an assistance or something, and it needs to be rolled out effectively. So when any party makes promises like this, I'm a tad suspicious. They want to renationalise water and energy, amongst other things. Lots of people are up in arms about this, but I don't particularly see the problem. The shift to private energy suppliers and private water suppliers has led to big increases in costs, some shenanigans in terms of the behaviour of some of these companies, with them hoodwinking people, cold calling, making people switch when they weren't really sure what they were doing, getting them into a worse deal, that sort of thing. All the kind of capitalist stuff you come to expect. Now, being able to switch providers can be good in that you can constantly chase down the best deal, but that does require you to be an active person chasing the best deal. With a single nationalised source, your input comes with voting, and they have direct accountability to you as the consumer, as the voter, not to shareholders. So that can be better. It can also be worse. It depends who's in charge of the government at the time, obviously. But in theory, I'm in favour of doing this because it should be able to bring prices down, because it doesn't have to serve shareholders. It can be run at cost, and that makes everything a lot more affordable for everybody, which has to be a good thing, I think, given the increased poverty in this country. They want to encourage gigafactories to come here to the UK, but we know that they're not coming to the UK now. Elon Musk announced that already. They're going to Europe, It's not just to do with tax breaks and encouragement and investment and so on. It's also to do with just-in-time shipping and everything else. Without a strong Remain stance, Labour promising to encourage gigafactories and so on is pointless, because they're just not going to come here. So I don't see why they bothered putting that. They talk about an ethical trade policy that would encourage green issues. Some of what they talk about, and I don't particularly know why this was under green issues, I think it's because when they're providing employment and so on, they talk about seeking to provide this employment in particular to women, minorities, veterans and so on. In other words, they're advocating for an explicitly discriminatory process of providing training bursaries and so on. It's not very egalitarian, it's not very socialist, and that will only deepen racial and other divisions in the country. So I think that's a bad idea. It should be means tested, but not tested on the basis of gender or race or whatever else. So that concerns me. They talk about retaking public ownership of some bus services and so on to make sure that there's provision of full service, restoring routes and so on, to encourage people to use public transport, which is more efficient and cost effective and greener than private transport. Again, case in point here, I live out in the sticks. Our bus services have been cut and cut and cut and cut, and local councils, parish and otherwise, have had to step in anyway to provide funding to essentially bribe bus companies to provide public transport services out to the villages. So from my point of view, this can only be a good thing, because it allows elderly people in more rural areas to gain access to towns and cities and all the rest of it in a way that they don't otherwise have, and for poorer people to have the same access. So that's a big thing to increase the quality of life for a lot of people. And if these things provide an important social service, but they're non-profitable in terms of raw money, then it only seems to make sense to me to either subsidise or to take them over. They say they want to tackle food security issues. They want people to not have to use food banks, but the manifesto is a bit thin on how they would actually go about doing that. Public services is another big area for Labour traditionally, and always has been. They talk about ending the cuts and providing more money to invest in the NHS, particularly frontline services, things like accident and emergency and social care, which is woefully understaffed and woefully underfunded at the moment, which is all great. They talk about how they're going to fund this with progressive taxation. So if you earn more than £80,000 a year, you will pay more tax. And there will also be windfall taxes and more taxes on corporations. They want to close tax loopholes that companies like Vodafone and so on have been using. If companies like Vodafone had paid what they owed, just a few years ago, that would have made up the entire shortfall in the NHS with more to spare back then. So tax avoidance, tax evasion, that is a big issue, and the big companies, particularly the big tech companies, are avoiding paying their dues while taking advantage of national infrastructure and so on, which they should be helping to support and pay into. Whether Labour can raise enough funds seems to be a big question, and whether this taxing will be punitive remains a big question. But it's not disproportionate to what a lot of Northern European nations and other mainland European nations raise in terms of tax. It's just really about what you want as a nation. Do you want to make sure that you have the best possible services in all of these areas? Do you want a decent baseline that any member of your society has, in which case you're going to have to tax more, but we all benefit, and it's a lot more cost effective most of the time to do things like this. So it's not crazy, and I kind of resent that socialism has become a terrible word in the UK in the same way that it has in the US, with an equal lack of understanding of what the term actually means, or the effectiveness of social investment and so on. Of course, like anything, it can go too far, but still. They want to end outsourcing and public-private partnerships in things like the NHS, so bring it all within the state rather than farming it out to companies that are looking to make profit. As with energy and other things, this should keep prices down and make these more accountable to the general public. But also, again, it does very much depend who's in power at the time. So a bad government can be as much of a problem as anything else. Technically, we still get NHS dentistry, but it's extremely hard to find an NHS dentist. Labour want to kind of partially drag dentistry back under the NHS in terms of providing free checks. This will probably be some sort of requirement of dentists' offices around the UK, and doubtless they'll get some sort of compensation for the government for this. I would rather see a full re-NHSing of dentistry in the UK. But for some reason that's the one thing Labour have chosen not to renationalise. They talk about an NHS forest, replanting trees all over NHS grounds, of about 1 million trees. That sounds like a lot, but it's not particularly. That would only offset the carbon of relatively few people, because even if you live fairly frugally with a relatively small carbon footprint, as I do, it will take about 400 trees being planted to offset the carbon that I create. So 1 million trees on NHS grounds, it's a nice gesture. It would make the land around hospitals a lot prettier and nicer, but in terms of carbon offset, it's a drop in the bucket, which isn't to say that they shouldn't do it. It's just I think they need a more aggressive tree planting strategy. They offer a relatively small mental health investment, and that's mostly going to be focused on mental health hospitals. As someone with mental health issues, I welcome the investment, but I don't think they're spending it the right way, or in a way that will help the most number of people. The amount of people who end up committed compared to the total number of people with mental health issues is relatively small. It'll be more cost effective, I think, to provide better training for GPs, general practitioners, family doctors, and better access to other forms of treatment than CBT counselling, which is pretty much all they offer at the moment under the mental health services. And that sucks. They are fairly aggressively pro-vaccination, which may well cost them some of the middle class vote, but good for them. They want to provide proper sexual health services. Sex and drugs education was something I was involved in many years ago, and the government, which was conservative at the time, was always kind of coy about doing this. It wasn't particularly popular with older and more conservative voters. Not as bad as it is in the US, but pretty bad. But seeing a major party commit to overturning that is a good thing. They want to invest in early education, and all the statistics suggest that this has a massive knock-on positive effect throughout education and in terms of people's participation in society and criminality and so on. So that's good, should essentially pay for itself. They want a broader curriculum. Under the Conservatives and under the previous Labour administration, education became more about job training than about actual education. But here in the UK we have a very strong presence in art and music and fashion and design, and it would only make sense to encourage that, because just 1 or 2 successful people pursuing that career more than pays for itself. So I'm in favour of that. They want to close tax loopholes for private schools and integrate them better with the broader school service, and by taxing them properly help fund the publicly owned schools. This gets confusing in the UK because private schools are called both private schools and public schools, and we don't really have a word for state-owned schools in the same way. It gets very confusing, but yeah, I'm all for that. They want to scrap tuition fees and bring back student grants. This will be expensive, but I think it's a good thing, and if other nations can manage it, then we can. But I also think that higher education isn't the be-all and end-all, and we need more options for vocational and technical training, things like that, apprenticeships, not just university. And I also think universities need to shift more towards retraining, which they do mention. As old industries churn, as technology improves, you often need to retrain in life to keep up to date as technology shifts. And That's a good thing. They want to take a public health approach to substance abuse. I doubt they'll follow through on this because it's never popular to legalise or decriminalise drugs, or to treat it as a public health issue rather than a criminal issue, because the public's just ill-informed on this. But good for them for at least saying so. They want less custodial sentences, but the methods that they suggest for dealing with unnecessary custodial sentencing, so prison time, look pretty gendered and racially biased. Whereas there's already a sentencing gap, a punishment gap. Men tend to get punished already more than women for the same crime. They're not tackling that. They're talking about putting even less women in prison for even less time, and even less ethnic minorities in prison for even less time. You don't deal with bias and racism and sexism by further entrenching existing biases. In my opinion, the aim should be to treat everyone equally. So having these alternatives just for women is bigoted. So I cannot support that. They also support a gendered approach to domestic violence and sexual abuse, which is already massively biased in favour of women, while men are 40% of the victims of domestic violence and a much larger percentage of the victims of sexual violence and problems than we already admit. And under British law, a woman can't rape a man. I mean, they can in the colloquial usage, but legally it's not rape. Made to envelop is not a... Sorry, made to penetrate is not a crime. Yeah, that's not helpful. They want to decentralise to local councils to give them more control over money, which is good. That's a democratisation. That's a Northern European, Scandinavian model that I support. They want to reinvest in and regenerate the high street. I think this is hopeless. This is something our local council is doing over in Andover. They're trying to regenerate the high street, but people just do their shopping online. And so you're just throwing good money after bad. Other than essential services that you need to be there in person for, banks perhaps, or some clothing stores, experiences, restaurants, specialist niche stores, there's no saving the high street, and it's just a complete waste of money, in my not so humble opinion. They want to reinvest in the fire services, which have been cut under the Tories. Good, fair enough. One thing that's very controversial is their pledge to renationalise some of the broadband infrastructure and to provide a free broadband service across the UK. I don't really know why this is considered so crazy, because a lot of government services are shifting to online, but there are still huge parts of the UK that do not have decent internet services, cannot get decent connectivity, and so they're cut off from a lot of government services. This has particularly been a problem with the Tories' shift away from sort of piecemeal benefits towards their online service, with people being basically unable to pursue or being unaware of problems with their benefits as they move onto the universal credit system. So, and the internet is so much the warp and weft of today's society. Participation in politics, in work, in everything, right? In education, that not having access to broadband holds a lot of people back, and particularly poor people. So it makes perfect sense for the government to step in and to roll out the fibre optic backbone to every part of the UK, even where it's uneconomical for a private business to do so. And it makes sense to provide at least a basic broadband service to everybody to bring everyone's opportunities up a notch. Plus, something that people seem to miss constantly, but I'm always thinking about, is the opportunity for people to work from home more has a massively positive knock-on effect for the environment. Less driving, less shipping, less repeat and unnecessary journeys, less fuel burnt. It's a very green thing to provide people all these services to increase flexibility in working, which they do mention later on, and so on. So free and universally available high-speed broadband is definitely worth it and will probably pay for itself fairly rapidly, both financially and in green terms, if businesses can embrace that kind of technology. I mean, already help and support lines, phone sex services and so on are routed digitally and then farmed out to people who are otherwise at home and just pick it up and do their job wherever they happen to be at the time. It's a good thing. I am concerned about their interventionist approach on the internet when it comes to protecting children and about fake news. In theory, these are good things. In practice, they can be implemented in very, very bad ways. But they do talk about a Charter of Digital Rights that British citizens would have under law in the UK, which could be a good thing depending how it's rolled out. So overall, pretty good. Some concerns about how the money will be raised for a lot of this, but a lot of it will pay for itself. There was an article a couple of days ago estimating that their renationalisation efforts, or at least most of them, the post office, water, power and so on, would pay for themselves within 7 years. So it just makes sense to invest in and do that, and then it would be earning profit for the British people. Why not have it in public ownership? Poverty and equality issues are a big thing for Labour, as you'd expect. They want to work to eliminate in-work poverty, which is a big problem in this country. You can have two-parent families, both parents working and still in poverty. So they want to raise the minimum wage to £10 an hour, and that's for everyone 16 or older at the moment. There's a kind of break point, so that seems like a reasonable idea to me. There's a sweet spot in minimum wage. Too high, it causes problems. Too low, it causes problems. Somewhere in the middle, there's a sweet spot where it makes most things better and very few things worse. £10 an hour seems about right instinctively to me. They want workers to have more inclusion in the success of their business so that they gain profit if the business does well, so that they have buy-in, so they can share in the same way that shareholders and owners do. Sounds good. They want to do a pilot scheme of UBI. Another pilot scheme. There have been plenty of pilot schemes of UBI all around the world. Overwhelmingly successful in the majority of cases. Pay for themselves in terms of better health, mental health, and other outcomes, such as people being free to set up small businesses or to be carers for elderly parents and so on. But if we have a pilot scheme, it will almost certainly come back positive, but will they go further? That remains to be seen. They want the post office to provide better services for self-employed people like myself, which is good because I can't always get into the bank. And they want to get rid of fake self-employed. We have a problem, it's not just zero-hour contracts, but even broader than that, with companies employing people technically as freelancers rather than employees, and thereby they don't have as many rights and so on, but it's self-employed in name only. So that's an issue. Getting rid of that seems like a good idea. Want to reinforce workers' rights, so you will have the full rights of someone on the job from day one. I think there's like a 3-month grace period or something at the moment. They'll also extend protections for whistleblowers, make sure you're paid for your breaks. If your shift gets cancelled, you'll get some kind of compensation. More flexible working, which will have to be coupled with the broadband rollout, in my opinion. They want to increase maternity leave to 1 year and double paternity leave to 4 weeks. They want to give you bereavement leave and 4 new bank holidays. That all sounds good to me. Doesn't seem to be too impactful, should be positive, all things considered. I am concerned in that they still believe in the gender pay gap, even though it's not really a thing. And they also talk about race and disability issues around pay. It really needs to be fixated on class and wealth, I think. It needs to be depending on your means rather than anything else, because that's the determining factor. Choice and so on should be as open as possible, but this is going to create further divisions and problems and leave behind the kind of people who are already being left behind, which in education, for example, is white working class boys. So this is fixing the wrong problem, a problem that doesn't even necessarily exist, when, as the Labour Party, I would much prefer that they would focus on class and wealth issues. I'm also concerned about their emphasis on anti-harassment. Nobody is for harassment, but anti-harassment legislation can create a hostile workplace and all sorts of other problems because it tends to overreach, so that's concerning. Now, their idea of a 4-day week has been laughed at, but what they're actually talking about is a 32-hour week. Now, if you work 9 to 5 with an hour for lunch, you're currently working only a 35-hour week. There's not that much difference between 35 and 32. You know, give everyone a slightly longer lunch break and you're pretty much there, really. And there are limits on exactly how much you can be forced to work by your employer and how much you can volunteer to work for. So there's some changes about that, but not anywhere near as much or as drastic. They say this will be paid for by productivity increases, which again has been laughed at. But if we look back historically, so in 1947, the amount of work you did was directly proportional, by and large, to the amount of pay you got. 1-to-1, essentially, right? And since 1947 through to 2017, which was the last statistics I could find, there has been a constant increase in productivity, bit bumpy, but by and large, pretty constant. But pay has not increased to anything like the same level. So it's no longer 1-to-1, it's 5 productivity to 3 pay, essentially. So if we were being paid proportionately to our productivity at this point, we would only be working 21-hour weeks. So a 32-hour week isn't so much of a big ask, I don't think, when we look at it in historical context. So I don't think it's laughable, I think it's doable, and again it would bring us more in line with other European nations. If they can do it, we can do it, we're not worse than them, right? I am concerned about all of this women inequalities reinforcement because they make no mention of men, and again, like I said, boys are failing in education, and this is just going to further entrench biases and bigotry based on race and gender and so on and make these things worse. Whereas if you focus on class and wealth, then the aid naturally falls where it's most needed, which seems a better approach to me. They've got a somewhat nationalistic approach to immigration, which is more traditionally associated with the right, but I think this reflects them trying to appeal to the anti-foreigner sentiment of Brexit, sort of heavy areas and so on. What they do suggest, actually, though, isn't as right-wing or bigoted as that would appear. They talk about extending the same workers' protections as native workers have to migrant and immigrant workers, which would mean they're competing on a level playing field, which seems like a reasonable approach to me, I think. Then it's really just down to your capacity and willingness to work, and then you can't really complain anymore past that. They want to protect freedom of movement, whether we're in or out of the EU, which kind of points to where the negotiations are inevitably going to land, which is going to be very close to the EU. So why leave at all? It's the question, why not just straight up make the argument for Remain in the same way that the Lib Dems and the Greens and others have? Seems weird to me. They want to reform the Department of Work and Pensions to being the Department of Social Security and shift it from a culture of blame and suspicion to one of help and support. As someone who's been on the sharp end of the DWP, I can only speak in encouragement and support of that. I'm not so sure about ending universal credit. You see, the idea of universal credit is good. Centralisation, bringing all the different strands of benefits and so on together into one place where you can see it all and negotiate it all and keep up to date with it all and make sure your payments and stuff are sorted and appeal and all the rest of it. The problem isn't the idea of a centralised universal credit system. The problem is the Tories, who have used it as an excuse to cut people's benefits and haven't made accommodation for people who can't access it online easily. So, yeah, I would rather we kept universal credit but made it work than scrap it. But scrapping it and going back to the piecemeal approach is still preferable to the way it's currently run and done. But we do need a change in culture there, so I welcome that. They want to rebuild local housing, and they are going to get rid of the right to buy scheme. So that will solve the problem in a couple of generations, probably, if there's a sufficiently aggressive building of housing. And if it can remain under the control of the council, there's more motivation for councils to invest in housing, because they can then draw, admittedly low level, but they can then draw rent from it, which will bolster their local spending. So that seems like a win-win-win for everybody. pretty much. They want to boost ESA up by £30 a week. That would be roughly a boost of about 8 to 10%. What ESA is one of the things I get. And they want to extend JSA or something like JSA to people who are carers. So if you're stuck at home taking care of an elderly or disabled relative or something, you'll be entitled to the equivalent of job seekers allowance. It's barely enough to live on, but it's something. And if you combine that with the benefits that the disabled or extremely elderly relative would be entitled to, you could get by, I think. Wouldn't be easy. Maybe a bit of part-time work on top or something and you'd be okay, but it's better than the current situation. Affordable housing. Again, something I can speak to from experience. I live in a village, it's very chocolate boxy, it's kind of London overspill, lots of commuters live here. Very expensive. Not compared to central London, but otherwise very expensive. The Tories currently set the idea of affordable housing as being 80% of market value. Now, out here, even a relatively small bungalow like mine, yeah, it's a good chunk of £1 million would be needed to buy this property. And, you know, first-time buyers and so on, they certainly can't afford that. Even a massive mortgage is out of the reach of most people. And we've had lots of projects to build housing, and some of it's supposed to have been affordable housing for local people. They still can't afford to buy it. It's all a bit of a scam. So making it be actually affordable housing or council rental properties and insisting that a certain amount of properties on any particular development are that can only be a good thing. They want to end the Lords, remove the hereditary Lords, and replace the House of Lords with a Senate of regional and local representatives, which sounds good to me. And they want to hold a constitutional convention to re-examine and possibly to codify a UK constitution. All for that as well. But conspicuously absent is proportional representation. But then why would Labour go for that when it favours the two-party system? They want to repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. I'm against that because being able to call an election whenever you want favours the incumbent party. So they can wait for a positive, good moment to call an election, which favours them. It's not fair, basically. So I don't know why they want to do that. Independent boundary reviews, good. That'll help with issues that we have been plagued by, where boundaries get rewritten to help the incumbent government. So that's good. They want to extend the voting franchise to 16. Lots of people are against that. I'm for it. I was politically aware and active even before I was 16. Since I was maybe 12 or 13 even, I've been interested in and engaged in politics. So that makes sense to me. And they want to extend the vote to all UK residents, not just UK citizens. So basically anyone who has a stake in the way the country is run. Sounds good to me. And they will abandon voter ID plans. Again, controversial, but fake votes aren't really any kind of significant issue here in the UK, and voter ID has been shown to suppress the vote in lots of places in a way that tends to favour conservative and right-wing governments. So it makes sense to try and avoid that. They also want to get rid of certain donations, dark money, to control lobbyists. They want to give the Electoral Commission more teeth to punish people who break electoral law, like Vote Leave did during the referendum. Yeah, they were punished, but it was small potatoes, really, compared to the damage that they've done. They also want to introduce legislation so that it's kind of stealth electoral campaigns. Again, something that Vote Leave did during the referendum, so that they have to be visible and known and so forth. So there'll be less opportunity for kind of grey market political influence and misuse of data, which will, again, all seems good to me. MPs will not be allowed second jobs that are paid, with a few notable exceptions for people who have to do a certain amount of work in order to retain their professional qualifications. So that's things like nurses and doctors and that sort of thing. Seems fair enough. They want to extend the Freedom of Information Act so that if it's a private company that's providing public services, it's subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So currently only governmental bodies and groups are subject to that. You can request your data and information from them, while private providers aren't subject to that. So now they would be, which is extra transparency, seems like a good idea to me, and part of the cost of doing business with the public. They want to bring parity of abortion and equal marriage rights. in Northern Ireland to match the same as on the mainland. No problem there. They want to get rid of any potential hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, which again is an indicator that any Labour Brexit isn't really going to be much for Brexit, so we might as well just remain, and they might as well come out and say so. And they want to increase investment in Wales and Scotland and the regions of England. Now, living in the south of England, where a lot of the money gets spent currently, I should be against this, I guess, but being a fair-minded chap, I recognise that these areas have been massively underinvested in over time, and it's only fair. Everything else is long on words, but short on content. When it comes to Brexit, okay, here is the Labour plan. Right. If they come into power, they will immediately ask for an extension, negotiate a new deal with the EU, which does look possible because they're willing to move on a lot of the baseline problems that have caused issues for the Conservative Party. So freedom of movement, single customs area, all that kind of thing, very close legal alignment with the EU. They should be able to get a different deal, but I don't see the point, because we can have all that and remain. And it just seems to be leaving for the sake of leaving to assuage certain people, but not really leaving. So renegotiate and have a final vote, which will be between Labour's much softer Brexit or remain. And that's where we would appear to be. It just seems pointless to me. They're trying to be all things to all men, failing to do so, and they might as well have just come out strongly for remain and made the argument. And I think they could have made the argument. I think they could have convinced a lot of people, but they've chosen not to, so they're going into the election with this wishy-washy position, which I don't think is doing them any favours. It's intended to be strategic, but it's failing to do so, in my opinion. It just makes them look weak and indecisive. But there you go. They do have a plan. It's not incomprehensible, it's just pointless. Their approach to a lot of things is much more explicitly internationalist rather than globalist. They don't want to allow a Prime Minister to go to war without Parliament saying so. They want an ethical foreign policy. They want to examine the legacy of colonialism. I don't think that's so much of an issue for the UK as it is for other former colonial powers. I think we've already apologised a great deal and done a great deal on that score, but if it makes you feel better, I guess. And they want to increase funding for international aid and diplomacy, and like I say, have this ethical foreign policy, which is something New Labour talked about but never really did. Defence is always a big issue. They want to review everything and come up with a better plan so we don't end up with issues like having diesel-powered aircraft carriers with no aircraft, for example. They want more emphasis on cybersecurity and protections against foreign electoral interference. All sounds fair to me. Weirdly, they want to retain Trident, our nuclear deterrent. It's a pointless waste of money, and you would think that would be one way in which Labour could say, we'll scrap Trident and we'll put the money into other things to help other people. It seems like an open goal, really. Why they haven't come down on that, I don't know. I'm a little concerned in that within the defence section they talk about providing opportunities and investment for veterans. Not that I wish to begrudge veterans anything, but I get worried that we're going to end up with the kind of military worship society in the way that the US does. That whole deference, thank you for your service sort of thing. When a lot of these soldiers voluntarily broke their vows and went off to engage in illegal wars, when, under the Nuremberg precedent, they should have exercised their personal choice and ethics and refused. Only a handful of soldiers did in either the US or the UK, so I can't agree with this kind of open worship of the military and of soldiers. To quote Bill Hicks, aren't you all just hired killers? Really? One thing that is good though, they want to bring as many defence contracts as possible back in-house to the UK, which will aid employment and recirculate finances and forms part of their overall general business plan. So, what do I think overall? I mean, it is Some of this renationalisation, I think, goes too far. Some of it makes perfect sense. The stuff that will pay for itself. We do need massive social investment, particularly in the regions, particularly in the other nations of the UK besides England. That all makes sense. None of this is impossible, but it's all obviously being presented as if it is. I think it's more expensive than Labour are letting on. But there's nothing here that isn't already being done elsewhere in Europe. And I'm sure we can do the same thing, and I'm sure our values as a nation, as a people, are more in line with supporting and helping one another than our political and economic culture is for. I think we're less American and more European than our ruling class is. But they're unlikely to get into power this time round. Unless it's in alliance with somebody like the Lib Dems, and that would rein them in. So I guess the best outcome I could hope for in this election is a Lib-Lab alliance. But we'll see how it all goes. I don't think we're really going to see that much shift in the situation in Parliament. But there you go. I hope that's been enlightening. If you have any issues or anything you want to ask, pop them down in the comments. And this is a very long, wonky, boring video of just me talking over and over again, but what are you going to do? Zang.